It was a warm summer evening in Wilmington, Delaware, June 27th, 1996. The kind of night when the streets are quiet, the air feels heavy, and nothing out of the ordinary seemed to happen. But behind closed doors, in the shadows of this peaceful community, a secret was festering. A secret so dark, so twisted, that it would soon unravel into a nightmare no one could have imagined. Anne-Marie Fahey was just 28 years old, a vibrant, ambitious young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She worked as the governor's scheduling secretary, a job she'd earned through hard work and determination. But that evening, Anne-Marie didn't come home. She didn't call her friends, she didn't answer her family's frantic messages, and by the next day she had completely vanished. At first people thought maybe she needed space, maybe she'd gone off to clear her head. But Anne-Maria wasn't the type to disappear without a word, and as days turned into weeks, her loved ones began to fear the worst. What no one realized, not yet anyway, was that Anne-Maria wasn't just missing. She was the victim of something far more sinister. You see, Anne-Maria had been keeping a secret that would shock everyone who knew her. She was involved in a forbidden love affair, a tangled web of lies, betrayal, and deceit. The man she was seeing wasn't just older, wealthier, and powerful. He was married. And not just married to anyone. He was married to her own sister. According to resources online, Thomas Capano was a high-profile lawyer, a man with influence and charm, but also someone with a reputation for being controlling and manipulative. Anne-Marie had tried to break things off with him, to move on and rebuild her life, but Thomas wasn't the kind of man to let go easily. He couldn't stand the idea of losing her, and on that warm summer night in June, their affair would come to a horrifying end. What happened to Anne-Marie Fahey? How did her life become tangled in a deadly love triangle? And what drove Thomas Capano, a man with everything, to commit one of the most shocking crimes Wilmington had ever seen? This is a story of love, obsession, and betrayal. But most of all, it's a story of how a dark secret can destroy everything in its path. June 27th, 1996. For most people, it was just another ordinary summer day, but for Anne-Marie Fahey, it was the last day anyone would ever see her alive. That evening, she met up with a man she thought she could trust, a man she had once been deeply involved with, but what Anne-Marie didn't know was that this dinner would mark the beginning of the end, and that by the time the night was over, her life would take a horrifying turn. Anne-Marie Fahey was the kind of person everyone loved to be around. At just 28 years old, she had accomplished more than most people her age could dream of. She was ambitious, smart, and driven, and her role as the scheduling secretary for the governor of Delaware had earned her respect and admiration from her peers. But there was something about Anne-Marie that made her stand out even more. Her kindness and warmth. She had a way of lighting up a room, of making people feel important, and her friends and family adored her for it. But behind that brilliant smile, Anne-Maria was struggling with her own insecurities. She had grown up in a family that faced its fair share of challenges, and she often fought feelings of self-doubt. Still, she pushed forward, determined to build a better life for herself. To those who knew her, Anne-Maria seemed to have it all together. But what they didn't know, what no one could have foreseen, was that her life was being pulled into a dangerous spiral by someone she thought she could trust. That someone was Thomas Capano. Thomas Capano was a man of power and influence. At 47, he was a successful attorney, well-connected and wealthy. On the surface, he seemed like the kind of man everyone respected, charming, confident, and in control. But beneath that polished exterior, there was a darker side to Thomas Capano. He had a reputation for being manipulative, controlling, and at times, dangerously obsessive. Thomas had been married for years and had a seemingly perfect family, but, as investigators would later discover, his marriage wasn't the picture-perfect image he portrayed to the world. Behind closed doors, Thomas was a man who thrived on control, especially when it came to women. And Anne-Maria Fahey had unknowingly become the latest target of his manipulative games. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Thomas wasn't just married. He was married to Kathleen Fahey, Anne-Marie's older sister. Kathleen was the kind of person who always believed in the best in people. She loved her husband, trusted him, and had no idea about the betrayal brewing right under her nose. While Kathleen was busy building a life with Thomas, he was living a double life. One where he pursued Anne-Marie in secret, exploiting her vulnerabilities and using his influence to pull her into an affair that would ultimately cost her everything. End side. Anne-Marie had tried to end the relationship with Thomas. She knew it wasn't right and she wanted to move on, to leave the past behind and find the happiness she deserved. But Thomas wouldn't let her go. He saw Anne-Marie as something he owned, something he could control, and when she started to pull away, when she began to reclaim her independence, Thomas's obsession only grew stronger. On the evening of June 27, 1996, Anne-Marie agreed to meet Thomas for dinner. No one knows exactly what was going through her mind that night. Maybe she thought she could end things peacefully. Maybe she still trusted him enough to believe it would be just a normal dinner. But what we do know is that Anne-Marie never made it home that night. Her family began to worry almost immediately. Anne-Marie wasn't the type of person to just disappear. She was responsible, reliable, and always stayed in touch with her loved ones. When her brother called her apartment the next day and got no answer, alarm bells started ringing. Everything was fine. Police didn't think much of Anne-Marie's disappearance. People go missing for all kinds of reasons, they said. Maybe she needed some space, or maybe she just wanted to get away for a while. But her family knew better. They knew Anne-Marie would never leave without telling someone, and as the hours turned into days, their worst fears began to take shape. According to online sources, the investigation into Anne-Marie's disappearance would soon uncover shocking revelations. As detectives dug deeper, they found themselves entangled in a web of lies, betrayal, and deceit. The man she had gone to dinner with, the man she thought she could trust, wasn't just involved in her disappearance. He was the key to understanding what really happened that night. What started as a secret affair had spiraled into a deadly game of control and obsession. And as the truth slowly began to surface, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a case of a missing person. It was something far more sinister. A tragedy that would leave an entire community. To understand how Anne-Marie Fahey's life became tangled in the web of deceit and danger, we have to go back to the beginning of her relationship with Thomas Capano. Anne-Marie was a young woman full of promise, but like many people, she carried invisible wounds. Growing up, she had struggled with self-esteem and feelings of inadequacy, insecurities that followed her into adulthood. She had worked hard to build a better life for herself, landing a prestigious job as the scheduling secretary for the governor of Delaware. On the surface, it looked like Anne-Marie had it all: beauty, ambition, and a bright future ahead of her. But deep down, she still battled a sense of not being good enough. Thomas was everything Anne-Marie thought she was missing. He was older, confident, and powerful, a man who seemed to have the world at his feet. At 47, Thomas was a successful lawyer with a reputation for charm and influence. He knew how to command attention, how to make people feel special. And for Anne-Marie, who was still trying to find her place in the world, Thomas's attention felt intoxicating. But there was something about Thomas that Anne-Marie couldn't fully see at first. Something dangerous lurking beneath the polished exterior. He had built a life with Anne-Marie's older sister, Kathleen, a woman who trusted him completely. But that didn't stop him from pursuing Anne-Marie. In fact, it only seemed to fuel his desire. Thomas was the kind of man who thrived on power and control, and for him, the secret affair wasn't just about love or attraction. It was about domination. He wanted to have Anne-Marie in his grasp, to make her dependent on him, and he used every tool at his disposal to pull her in. According to sources online, Thomas showered Anne-Marie with gifts, lavish dinners, expensive jewelry, and promises of a life she could only dream of. He made her feel seen, valued, and special in a way she hadn't felt before. But what Anne-Marie didn't realize was that Thomas wasn't just giving her attention, he was taking control. Slowly but surely, he was isolating her, making her feel like he was the only one she could rely on. She slipped from her life. At first, Anne-Marie believed him. She believed his promises, his affection, and his insistence that he cared for her. But as time went on, the cracks in Thomas's charm Anne-Marie started to see the other side of him. The possessiveness, the manipulation, the way he seemed determined to control every aspect of her life. He would call her constantly, question her whereabouts, and demand her attention. And when Anne-Marie tried to pull away, even just a little, Thomas would double down. He would remind her of everything he had done for her, guilt her into staying, and make her feel like she owed him something. It wasn't long before Anne-Marie realized that this wasn't love. This was something else entirely, something darker, something dangerous. Anne-Marie knew the affair was wrong. She knew it was a betrayal, not just to Kathleen, but to herself. And as the weight of the relationship grew heavier, she made a decision. She wanted out. She told Thomas it was over. She told him she couldn't do it anymore, that she needed to move on with her life. But Thomas wouldn't let her go. For a man like Thomas Capano, losing wasn't an option. Anne-Marie wasn't just someone he cared about. She was someone he believed he owned, and the thought of her walking away, of reclaiming her independence, was something he couldn't accept. Thomas began to escalate. He became more controlling, more obsessive, and more desperate to keep Anne-Marie in his grasp. He would show up unannounced, call her repeatedly, and refuse to take no for an answer. Anne-Marie began to realize that Thomas wasn't just controlling, he was dangerous. Every time she tried to distance herself, he pulled her back in, tighter and tighter, until she felt like she couldn't breathe. She confided in friends, telling them how scared she was, how she felt trapped. But no one could have predicted just how far Thomas would go to keep her in his life. By the time Anne-Marie fully understood the danger she was in, it was already too late. What started as a secret affair had spiraled into an obsession, one that would end in tragedy. And the man she once thought she could trust, the man who had promised her the world, would soon take June 27th, 1996. It was a Thursday evening, warm and quiet, with the streets of Wilmington, Delaware settling into their usual calm. But for Anne-Marie Fahey, that evening was anything but ordinary. She had plans that night. Plans to meet a man she had once been deeply involved with, a man who had promised her so much, but who had now become a source of fear and anxiety. That man was Thomas Capano. The two met at a high-end restaurant in the heart of Wilmington, a place where Thomas often entertained clients and friends. It was the kind of place where the food was expensive, the wine flowed freely, and the atmosphere was meant to exude elegance and charm. But for Anne-Marie, this wasn't a romantic dinner. It wasn't a celebration. It was the next step in her attempt to leave Thomas behind and move on with her life. No one knows exactly what was said at the dinner table that night. Was there tension in the air? Did Anne-Marie try to end things once and for all? Or did Thomas, in his usual fashion, try to manipulate her, to convince her to stay? What we do know is this. After that dinner, Anne-Marie Fahey disappeared. She didn't go home. She didn't call her friends. She didn't show up for work the next day. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Her family noticed almost immediately. Anne-Marie was close to her siblings, especially her brothers, and she never went long without checking in. When her brother called her apartment and got no answer, he knew something was wrong. By the next day, the Fahey family was panicked. They reported Anne-Maria missing, but the response they got from the police was less than reassuring. At first, investigators didn't take her disappearance seriously. People go missing all the time, they said. Maybe she just needed some time to herself. Maybe she had decided to leave town for a few days and would come back when she was ready. But Anne-Maria's family knew better. This wasn't like her. She didn't just disappear. And the more time passed, the more they feared that something terrible had happened. The investigation into Anne-Maria's disappearance began slowly. Police started by piecing together her last known movements, retracing her steps from the night of June 27th. The last confirmed sighting of Anne-Maria was at the restaurant, sitting across the table from Thomas Capano. From there, the trail went cold. Detectives questioned Thomas, who claimed he had simply dropped Anne-Marie off at her apartment after dinner. He insisted that she was fine, that nothing unusual had happened, and that he had no idea where she might have gone. To some, his story seemed believable. After all, Thomas was a respected lawyer, a man with influence and connections. Why would someone like him have anything to do with her disappearance? But Anne-Marie's family wasn't convinced. They knew about the relationship between Anne-Marie and Thomas. They knew that she had been trying to end things with him, that she had confided in friends about how scared she was, how controlling and obsessive Thomas had become. They told investigators everything they knew, hoping it would help bring Anne-Marie back. For it had been 2 years since she'd left Greenland. As detectives dug deeper into Anne-Marie's life, they uncovered a shocking revelation, one that would change the course of the investigation. Anne-Marie hadn't just been involved with Thomas Capano, she had been involved in a secret affair with him. And he wasn't just any man. He was married. Worse still, he was married to Anne-Marie's own sister. The discovery sent shockwaves through everyone who knew Anne-Marie. How could this have happened? How had this secret been kept for so long, and most importantly, what role had this affair played in her disappearance? The more investigators learned about Thomas Capano, the more they began to suspect that he wasn't being entirely honest. His calm demeanor, his insistence that he had nothing to do with Anne-Maria's disappearance, began to seem like a carefully crafted act. The timeline didn't quite add up. His story had inconsistencies, and the more they pressed, the more it became clear that Thomas knew more than he was letting on. But even with their suspicions, investigators had little to go on. There was no body, no physical evidence, and no witnesses who could place Thomas anywhere other than at the restaurant that night. It was as if Anne-Marie had simply disappeared into the ether, leaving behind nothing but questions and heartbreak. Her family refused to give up hope. They held press conferences, distributed flyers, and pleaded with the public for any information about Anne-Maria's whereabouts. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence grew heavier. And behind that silence, behind the unanswered calls and the sleepless nights, one question loomed larger than any other. What had happened to Anne-Marie Fahey? Well, the answer was out there, hidden in the shadows of Thomas Capano's carefully constructed life. And as the investigation continued, detectives began to unravel the web of lies, deceit, and obsession that had led to Anne-Marie's disappearance. The truth, when it finally came to light, would be more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. As days turned into weeks, and Anne-Marie Fahey's disappearance remained a mystery, the Wilmington Police Department found themselves under increasing pressure to uncover the truth. The Fahey family refused to let up, demanding answers, and the media began to pick up the story of the bright young woman who had vanished without a trace. Investigators knew they had to dig deeper, and all signs pointed to one man, Thomas Capano. Thomas had been the last person to see Anne-Marie alive. He admitted as much during his initial interviews with police, claiming that after their dinner on June 27, 1996, he had dropped her off at her apartment, just as he always had in the past. He assured them there was nothing unusual about that night, nothing at all. But to the detectives listening to him, something didn't feel right. At first glance, Thomas seemed calm and collected. Too calm, in fact. His answers were rehearsed, his demeanor unnervingly calculated, as though he had prepared for every question the police might throw his way. But as investigators began to dig deeper into his story, they started to notice cracks in his carefully constructed narrative. For one, there were inconsistencies in the timeline. Thomas claimed he had dropped Anne-Maria off shortly after their dinner, yet no one had seen her return to her apartment that night. Neighbors hadn't heard her come in, and there were no signs that she had entered her home. Her purse, her keys, and her belongings were all untouched. Detectives began to focus more closely on Thomas Capano. They obtained a warrant to search his home, hoping to find any clue, any trace, that might shed light on what had happened to Anne-Marie. What they found raised more questions than answers. Inside Thomas's home, investigators discovered evidence that sent chills down their spines. There were faint traces of blood in one of the rooms, blood that later testing would confirm did not belong to Thomas. There were signs of a struggle, furniture slightly out of place, scratches on surfaces, and a lingering sense that something violent had occurred there. But without a body, without more concrete evidence, the pieces weren't enough to build a full picture of what had happened. As the investigation continued, witnesses began to come forward, painting a darker portrait of Thomas Capano. People who knew him described a man who was charming on the surface but deeply controlling behind closed doors. Women who had been involved with Thomas in the past spoke of his obsessive tendencies, his need for power and control in his relationships. Sophie said, and Anne-Marie's friends revealed that she had confided in them about her growing fear of Thomas in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. One friend recalled Anne-Marie saying, "He won't leave me alone. No matter what I do, he keeps coming back." Another described how Anne-Marie had started looking over her shoulder, feeling as though she was being watched, and so sometimes 1 or 2 rituals of every day were taken for granted. But the breakthrough in the case, the moment that changed everything, came from an unexpected source: Thomas Capano's own brother, Gerard Capano. Gerard was a man who had always lived in his brother's shadow. Unlike Thomas, who was polished and successful, Gerard was rough around the edges, a man who had made his share of mistakes. But when detectives approached him during the investigation, they were unprepared for what he would reveal. Under pressure from the growing evidence and his own guilt, Gerard confessed to a chilling truth. Thomas had killed Anne-Marie Fahey. According to Gerard, Thomas had called him late one night, frantic and demanding his help. When Gerard arrived, Thomas revealed what he had done. Anne-Marie was dead, and Thomas needed to get rid of her body. Gerard described how Thomas had stuffed Anne-Marie's lifeless body into a large cooler, a cooler that Thomas had purchased specifically for this purpose. Together, the two brothers drove out to sea, taking a boat miles into the Atlantic Ocean. Under the cover of darkness, they dumped the cooler overboard, believing it would sink to the ocean floor, erasing any evidence of the crime. But even here, things didn't go as planned. Gerard confessed that the cooler didn't sink at first. It floated on the surface of the water, bobbing up and down as the two brothers panicked. Thomas, enraged, pulled out a gun and shot at the cooler, trying to force it to sink. Eventually, it disappeared beneath the waves, taking Anne-Marie's body with it. When investigators heard Gerard's story, they were stunned. It was a horrifying account, one that painted Thomas Capano as a cold, calculating killer who had gone to unimaginable lengths to cover up his crime. But there was still one problem. There was no body. The cooler and Anne-Marie's remains were nowhere to be found. Without them, prosecutors would face an uphill battle to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Thomas Capano was guilty. But detectives refused to give up. They began digging deeper into Gerard's story, corroborating every detail they could. They tracked down receipts for the cooler, matched the timeline of events with witness statements, and built a case that would eventually expose Thomas Capano for the monster he truly was. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just a case of a missing person. This was a story of obsession, control and betrayal. A story that would end with justice for Anne-Marie Fahey, no matter how long it took. By now, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, and the picture they painted was horrifying. Investigators had spent months unraveling the lies and deceit surrounding Thomas Capano, but the biggest question still loomed. What exactly had happened to Anne-Marie Fahey on the night of June 27, 1996? According to evidence and testimony, detectives reconstructed the chilling events of that evening. It is believed that after their dinner at a high-end restaurant in Wilmington, Thomas Capano convinced Anne-Marie to return to his home. Perhaps he wanted to talk, to try and change her mind about ending the relationship. Or maybe Anne-Marie, ever the kind and gentle soul, felt she owed him one last conversation. Whatever the reason, she went with him. What she didn't know was that this decision would seal her fate. Inside the walls of Thomas's home, the situation took a deadly turn. It's believed that Anne-Marie, standing firm in her decision, told Thomas that their relationship was over for good. She wanted her life back. She wanted to move on. But for Thomas Capano, this wasn't just heartbreak. It was humiliation. He had spent months controlling Anne-Marie, manipulating her, making her feel as though she needed him. The idea of losing her, of her walking away and reclaiming her independence, was something he couldn't accept. The argument escalated. Voices were raised, tempers flared, and then, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, Thomas Capano snapped. What happened next remains the subject of debate. Some sources suggest that Thomas pulled out a gun and shot Anne-Marie in a moment of blind fury. Others believe he strangled her, his hands tightening around her neck as he silenced her cries for help. Regardless of the method, the end result was the same. Anne-Marie Fahey, the bright, ambitious and kind-hearted young woman who had her whole life ahead of her, was dead. But for Thomas, the nightmare wasn't over. Now he had a problem, a big problem. He needed to get rid of the body. It was then that he turned to someone he thought he could trust, his brother, Gerard Capano. Thomas called Gerard in the middle of the night, his voice frantic and demanding. He told Gerard what had happened, though it's unclear how much detail he shared. What is clear, however, is that Thomas wasn't asking for help, he was demanding it. He needed Gerard to help him dispose of Anne-Marie's body, and Gerard, likely terrified and unsure of what to do, agreed. The plan was as cold and calculated as the murder itself. Thomas purchased a large cooler, a seemingly ordinary item that would soon become the centerpiece of his horrifying scheme. He placed Anne-Marie's lifeless body inside, sealing it shut. Then, under the cover of darkness, the two brothers loaded the cooler into a vehicle and drove to the marina, where Thomas had access to a boat. They took the boat miles out into the Atlantic Ocean, far from the coastline, where no one could see them. Out there, in the vast emptiness of the sea, they dumped the cooler overboard. But the plan didn't go as smoothly as Thomas had hoped. According to Gerard's later confession, the cooler didn't sink right away. Instead, it floated on the surface of the water, bobbing up and down like a terrible reminder of what they had done. Thomas, furious and desperate, pulled out a gun and fired at the cooler, piercing it with bullets until it finally began to sink beneath the waves, taking Anne-Marie's body with it. With the cooler gone, Thomas believed he had erased all evidence of his crime. He thought he was safe, but what he didn't count on was how determined investigators and Anne-Marie's family would be to uncover the truth. Months passed with no sign of Anne-Marie's body. The ocean, vast and unforgiving, had swallowed the evidence whole, leaving detectives scrambling to build a case against Thomas. Without a body, without direct physical evidence, Proving his guilt would be an uphill battle. But the Fahey family refused to give up. Against all odds, James Fahey said, "It's impossible. If I don't feel that I can kill him, it's something that cannot be explained." They held on to hope, even in the face of unimaginable grief. They kept Anne-Maria's name in the headlines, pushing for answers, demanding justice. And behind the scenes, investigators were working tirelessly, piecing together every shred of evidence they could find. Soon the knots would be broken wide. Then, after months of dead ends and frustration, a shocking break in the case changed everything. It was Gerard Capano who finally cracked under the pressure. Haunted by guilt and unable to keep the secret any longer, he came forward and confessed to his role in the crime. His testimony was chilling. He told investigators everything: how Thomas had killed Anne-Maria, how they had disposed of her body in the cooler, and how they had dumped it into the Atlantic Ocean. Gerard's confession was the key investigators had been waiting for. It confirmed their worst fears. Anne-Maria wasn't just missing, she had been murdered. And the man responsible was none other than Thomas Capano, the man who had claimed to love her. His hands shook. Even without a body, Gerard's testimony, combined with the mounting evidence against Thomas, was enough to move forward. But the battle for justice was far from over. As the case headed to trial, the full, horrifying truth of what had happened to Anne-Maria Fahey would finally come to light. The trial of Thomas Capano was a media spectacle, drawing attention from across the nation. As the case unfolded in the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Prosecutors stood poised to present a case that would shine a light on the dark reality of what had happened to Anne-Marie Fahey, a young woman whose life had been cut tragically short by a man who had claimed to love her. From the very beginning, prosecutors painted Thomas Capano as a cold, calculating murderer. They argued that he had killed Anne-Marie not just out of anger, but out of a desperate need to maintain control over her. He had manipulated her, used her vulnerabilities against her, and when he realized she was ready to walk away, he resorted to the ultimate act of control: murder. Witness after witness took the stand, detailing the toxic dynamics of Anne-Marie and Thomas's relationship. Among them was Gerard Capano, Thomas's own brother, whose shocking confession had turned the case on its head. Gerard recounted the events leading up to Anne-Marie's death in haunting detail. He described how Thomas had called him in a panic, how he had felt compelled to help his brother dispose of the body. The courtroom hung on every word, the weight of Gerard's testimony heavy with guilt and remorse. But it wasn't just Gerard's words that sealed Thomas's fate. Forensic evidence also played a crucial role in the case. Investigators presented blood samples found at Thomas's home, evidence that linked him directly to the crime. They outlined the timeline of events, showing how Thomas's story had changed and shifted under scrutiny. The inconsistencies in his statements painted a picture of a man who was not only guilty, but who had gone to great lengths to cover up his heinous act. As the trial progressed, the emotional toll on Anne-Marie's family became increasingly evident. They sat in the courtroom, their hearts heavy with grief, reliving the pain of their loss. Anne-Marie's family had come together, united in their quest for justice and determined to ensure that her story would not be forgotten. Anne-Maria's brother took the stand, his voice trembling with emotion as he recounted the devastating impact of her loss on their family. Tears filled his eyes as he spoke, and the weight of his words hung in the air. "She was our light," he said, his voice breaking, "and he took her from us." In that moment, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom just how deeply Anne-Marie's murder had affected her loved ones. They were not just grieving a daughter, a sister, a friend. They were fighting for justice on behalf of a woman who had brought so much joy to their lives. The jury listened intently, their faces reflecting the pain and horror of the testimony they were hearing. They were witnessing the unraveling of a life cut short, a life filled with potential and promise, extinguished in an instant by a man consumed by his own obsessions. After weeks of heart-wrenching testimony, the jury finally reached a verdict. Thomas Capano was found guilty of first-degree murder. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom as the verdict was read, the tension finally breaking like a dam bursting. Relief washed over Anne-Maria's family, who had fought so hard for justice. In 1998, Thomas Capano was sentenced to death. The courtroom erupted in a mix of emotions. Some celebrated the verdict, while others felt a somber weight hanging in the air. But as the years passed, Thomas's sentence was later commuted to life in prison, a reminder that even in the pursuit of justice, the system is not infallible. The trial of Thomas Capano was more than just a legal battle. It was a testament to the love and resilience of Anne-Marie's family, who refused to let her story fade into obscurity. They had fought for her, for the truth, and for justice, ensuring that her light would continue to shine, even in the face of darkness. As the gavel struck for the last time, marking the end of the trial, it also signaled the beginning of a new chapter for Anne-Marie's family. A chapter filled with the memories of a remarkable woman who would forever be remembered as a beacon of hope and love. As we reflect on the tragic case of Anne-Marie Fahey, it becomes painfully clear that her story is not just one of loss, but also a stark reminder of the darker aspects of human relationships. Anne-Marie, a vibrant young woman with so much potential, found herself ensnared in a web of manipulation and control. Her life was taken by someone she thought she could trust, someone who had promised her love, but instead delivered violence and betrayal. The events surrounding her disappearance and murder serve as a somber wake-up call. They remind us that relationships can sometimes mask a far more sinister reality. Manipulation, obsession, and control can escalate quickly, turning what seems like love into something dangerous. Anne-Maria's story haunts those who knew her, a lingering shadow that will never fade. Her family, her friends, and a community still grapples with the impact of her loss. They remember the laughter, the kind heart, and the light she brought into their lives. And while justice was served in the courtroom, the emotional scars left behind by her murder will remain for a lifetime. Anne-Maria's spirit endures in the hearts of those who loved her, a constant reminder of the importance of recognizing red flags in relationships and the need to speak up against manipulation. As we conclude this heartbreaking story, we invite you to reflect on it as well. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think justice was truly served for Anne-Marie? Was the life sentence enough to hold Thomas Capano accountable for the pain he caused? We want to hear from you. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life crime stories that explore the complexities of human nature and the pursuit of justice. Thank you for joining us as we remember Anne-Marie Fahey, a bright light extinguished too soon, but whose memory will continue to inspire and educate us all.